Welcome to Cerebral Women in Paris Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. Years ago, after hearing an artist say art will save us, my intellectual curiosity was sparked, and I began a journey to understand exactly how. Through conversations with visual artists and the professionals who support them, I explore how art helps us see our history, our culture, our lives, and the experience of others in ways no other medium can. Capturing these voices is essential. They remind us of the power of art and the importance of noticing life's simple beauty. And now, here in Paris, a city that has long welcomed the daring, the dreamers, and the defiant, I continue these conversations where art breathes, questions, and reminds us that creation itself is an act of liberation. Welcome and enjoy Cerebral Women in Paris. This episode features David Smalling. Born in Jamaica, he lives and works in New York. He studied mathematics at Yale University, where he also trained at the Yale School of Art and holds a Ph.D. from Harvard University. David's painting practice examines the invisible architectures through which cultural hierarchies, inherited rituals, and social taboos shape identity. Working through the visual language of Mannerism, Dutch Golden Age still life, and old master painting, he approaches the panel as a diagnostic surface, a place where shame, desire, aspiration, and restraint are staged with theatrical precision. His meticulous composition often unfold within domestic and ceremonial interiors, where silver platters, pearls, ribbons, brass instruments, mattresses, and other charged objects become symbols of belonging and control. His practice is also shaped by a rigorous computational process. Through proprietary systems developed by the artist, including autoglaze and wide gamut pigment, he decomposes images into physically realizable layers of translucent oil paint, translating questions of color, optics, and perception into a precise choreography of material execution. This fusion of algorithmic structure and classical craft allows his paintings to inhabit a space between artifice and revelation, where beauty becomes both seduction and evidence. Enjoy this episode featuring David Smalling, and visit cerebralwomen.com for his expanded bio. Welcome, David, to Cerebral Women Art Talks. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, Phyllis. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's begin with, when did you discover your artistic passion?
Wow, that's it goes way back. I mean, I don't know if I had a single eureka moment per se where I sort of suddenly discovered art. I mean, there were a few sort of step changes in my life, but by and large, it was sort of a gradual recognition that images could tell stories and hold things that language couldn't quite contain. And so I grew up not in the US, which is where I am right now and where I've been living for the past almost 20 years, but grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. And so, I'd always been drawn to the way objects and surfaces and interiors and gestures sort of carry emotion, from contemporary art back to the old masters. And so always been drawn to that even as a young man, and, growing up in Kingston, Jamaica. But over time, through high school and then going off to art school, to undergrad, I realized that painting sort of gave me a way to think about contradictions that I was living with, beauty, comfort, or aspiration versus shame, or more recently, access and constraint. And so the seduction of certain worlds and the cost of entering them, and so that's where the passion really became serious, and painting became not just something I love, but a way to sort of understand the world.
How do you define your practice?
Well, I define it as a contemporary painting practice that uses the visual language of the old masters as sort of a diagnostic instrument. So I'm interested generally in how beauty, luxury, etiquette, taste, and symbolic objects organize hierarchy, desire, power. And so I draw from Mannerism and the Dutch Golden Age, and sometimes Vanitas painting, and sort of a long history of still lifes, but not necessarily out of nostalgia for these particular genres. But I use those traditions because they remain incredibly sharp tools for describing contemporary life. And so while the materials have changed, the underlying structures remain: social performance, class aspiration, gender, shame, intimacy, the desire to belong. And so, paintings often begin as sort of seductive images, but that seduction is many times unstable. And so, within my practice and how I think about it, I want the viewer to be sort of pulled in by the luminosity and the surface, but slowly realize that something inside the image is sort of under pressure and not exactly at rest. So it's contemporary, but it's sort of using these older traditions as a lens for my own life.
Are your life experiences reflected in your work?
100%. I think my paintings tend to, oftentimes, whether I like it or not, exist as vignettes from moments in my own life. Moments of, the mundane, if you could even call it that, a moment with friends where there's anxiety, a breakup, meeting someone new that you vibe with. And so they reflect moments. They don't reflect sort of longitudinal themes so much so as more self-contained sort of flickers of humanity and an exchange between two individuals or more individuals or a group, but definitely reflect my life.
Are you influenced by other artists?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm deeply influenced by old master painting, especially the Dutch Golden Age. I'm also influenced by Mannerism, by Vanitas painting, and even more contemporary artists who really understood how objects could carry moral and psychological force. I'm heavily also influenced by artists who use beauty in complicated ways. That's another thing that really captivates me. I'm interested in painters who make seductive images that are not merely decorative, but the surface sort of invites you in and then implicates you. So Jan van Eyck matters to me for reflection and optical consciousness. The Dutch still life matters for its ability to turn sort of abundance into a meditation on time and decay. I think that's especially relevant in this day and age where there is, in some ways, one could argue, abundance, but time's inevitable, and then decay of all forms, right? Where we live in an extremely noisy society where it's very complicated. Mannerist painting matters to me because it understands elegance under strain. Inspired by contemporary painters like Kerry James Marshall, John Corrin, Cecily Brown, who understand artifice, distortion, and grotesque as forms of truth. So many others as well. I mean, those are just top of mind.
How did your professors impact your practice?
And that's an interesting one. I think the most important teachers didn't give me a style. They gave me a discipline of looking. They taught me that every decision in an image matters, even the ones that seem minor. They taught me that a painting has to be able to withstand sustained attention. And so I think professors can be important because they introduce resistance. They ask why something is there, why it's painted that way, why it needs to exist. And for me, at least, the best professors were like that. And that kind of questioning is often uncomfortable. And I think that's what's really helpful for a lot of my friends who have done MFAs. It's incredibly useful, that sort of resistance. And it teaches you not to confuse facility with necessity. And so I think the best artistic education that I've had sort of gives you permission and pressure at the same time. It gives you permission to take yourself seriously, and it pressures you to become more exacting in articulating your own ideas.
How has your technique developed or changed over the years?
Yeah, that's one thing that sort of stayed very constant, but evolved at the same time. It's become much more structured, more rigorous, but also more hybridized. In my recent exhibition at Templon, all the paintings were executed on wood panels, and that's something that I found a lot of joy in growing up as a teenager, and sort of took a break from in school and did a little bit of that scattered around over the past. I do like studies here and there on wood panels, but it wasn't really a central part of my practice. And so that part of the materiality has been an evolution, a pretty strong evolution in the past 3 years, let's say. But more broadly, hybridization has been a big change. Early on, I was more dependent on intuition, observation, sort of traditional painterly decision making. And over time, I began bringing my background in mathematics and computation and what we call color science into the studio. So that sort of inclusion of mathematics led me to develop systems that allow me to think about oil painting as an inverse problem. So, when you go to the store and you buy a tube of oil paint or acrylic or whatever pigment, the pigments are themselves rooted in tradition. So you have things like cadmium red or Prussian blue, and the underlying pigment combinations are usually like 1 to 3 pure pigments, chemicals like titanium white, which is made of titanium dioxide, that are suspended in some sort of a binder. And those pigments don't really correspond to any sort of well-defined kind of vertex in a color space, right? They kind of mean something from an intuitive standpoint, right? You kind of get used to like the red that you like or the blue that you like in art school, or like that's the color that I like to tint with, or like I like umber for my underpainting and so forth. But these colors, they don't align with any sort of axis that is methodical per se. They have evolved out of history and tradition. So Indian yellow is born out of East Asian history and the processing of how you were into making a yellow sort of tint, right? And so the point is I've sort of brought in mathematics and some amount of physics that look at the reflectance spectra of pigments and use that to decompose my reference imagery oftentimes into sort of physically realizable pigment layers and mixing recipes. And that sort of is interleaved with traditional painterly decision making to make for what I have found to be a very pleasant painting experience. So at the point of execution, I do a lot of drawings in advance, but when I'm actually executing an oil painting, the way that I actually go about it often feels very different to friends of mine who come for studio visits while I'm painting. And so a lot of that sounds technical, but for me, it doesn't remove the human element. It sort of just lets me be more precise about the physical conditions of the image so that the emotional and symbolic content becomes more charged. And so that technique has sort of moved me towards a strange combination of classical painting traditions and computational discipline that gives me just more control.
So I want to expand on that. Can you dive a little deeper into your process of choosing color?
Absolutely. So when we see colors, right, on a painting, for example, it's a bit different from when we look at a color of an image on an iPhone. When we look at a computer screen or an iPhone, what you're seeing are light that's being emitted, red light, for example, or blue light being emitted to form an image on a screen. Whereas when you look at a canvas, what you're seeing is reflected light. So the ambient light in the room or in the space or outdoors is by and large perceived as white or clear, right? It's sort of neutral, right? That's how sort of the brain perceives it. That's maybe how one might articulate it as like white light. And what that means is that the energy of the light at the various wavelengths across the visible spectrum is roughly the same. So that's what's called a power spectrum. So at each wavelength that the eye is sensitive to, the amount of energy that's hitting your eye and being sent to your brain is more or less flat. It's kind of like a flat spectrum. Now, when you pick up something that's blue light, what that means is that the blue part of the visible spectrum has energy in it, and the other parts of the spectrum, there is no energy. That energy has been absorbed. So when I look at a canvas and I perceive something like blue, what's happening is that the white light that's ambient is incident on the canvas, and then what is absorbed is everything other than the blue part of the spectrum. And the only part that's left over and reflected and comes back and hits your eye is the blue part of it, right? And so that's what's actually happening, which is a little bit different from what's happening in your phone, where it's a computer and so it makes the right color and then emits that from the screen, from like an LED or something like this. And so going back to what's happening on the canvas, what one is able to do is, if you're able to do some amount of physical analysis and a fair bit of elementary physics and some math, what you can do is you can scan the pigments from the specific brands and manufacturers. I like to use Winsor Newton and Gamblin for oil paints, and I used to use Liquitex a bit for acrylics, for some parts of, auxiliary parts of painting and so forth. What you're able to do is you're able to scan this specific red, let's say cadmium red, which a cadmium red from Winsor Newton oil paints might be very different from what they market as cadmium red deep or cadmium red light, or they've got all different kinds of words that they're using, and it's all sorts of magic potions. You don't really know what's in the magic potion in the souk, right? But each brand has a different name. And for an artist just picking up a tube, right, it doesn't really matter. You can sort of mix, you can do sort of color theory on your palette and kind of figure out what color you want intuitively and using some sort of elementary rules that you learn in any sort of 101 art class, even in high school. But if one is able to obtain fairly exacting control over what color you can realize from a mixed recipe of pigments by scanning the pigments and determining certain formulas and relationships between the spectra of what's reflected back to the viewer, right? So each pigment has associated with it a reflected spectra. So that kind of tells you, when you shine white light on that surface, just neutral light from a bulb, like a fluorescent or incandescent bulb, which frequencies get reflected back. And basically, what I am thinking about with these computational techniques that I mentioned, I'm thinking in terms of these reflected wavelengths and how, when I mix two pigments, how those reflected wavelengths change. And so, yeah, I'll pause there.
So, from the viewer's perspective, right? Collector buys a work, it's hanging in the hallway, they pass it every day. Are they capable of comprehending the complexity of the colors that you may or another artist may choose to use?
That's a great question. Sometimes. This recent show, I've painted with slightly less saturated colors. There have been compositions where I've gone out of my way to basically synthesize colors from the paints off the shelf, mixing pigments together in such a way that I'm able to obtain extremely saturated colors that are perceived as very, very saturated, where you can mix lapis lazuli with certain types of lead white, for instance, and get extremely saturated blues. And then that's something that a human will notice. You're like, wow, that's really blue. And this is the sort of thing that there are artists out there that have centered entire practices on this, and certainly entire bodies of work. Anish Kapoor studio and Jeff Koons' studio use these types of techniques quite heavily. I mean, they have whole teams of scientists that they work with. And at some point, I know Anish Kapoor had like a patent out on a special black paint color or something like this that caused some uproar. But there are studios that really think about this. Albert Olin also thinks about this sort of thing. And so it doesn't figure into my practice as a core aspect of what I'm trying to explore or share with the world. It figures as a tool, and it's a tool that comes easy to me. And so then why not use it? It comes very natural to me to sort of think about things numerically in a structured manner in many ways. But there are other aspects where I could use computational methods in my practice, and I don't, because it isn't as natural. When I think about making a composition, what I do is very ad hoc. Most people who get to know me and see me sort of working on a painting, once I have a drawing down and I'm painting from my drawing, my reference, or kind of I'm midway through executing on a painting, everything feels very structured in the studio. When I'm coming up with the actual reference image or actually thinking about my visual language and what I'm trying to say, that process is very ad hoc, old school, quite messy,
No journey is ever really the same. It's drawing, it's hybrid. Sometimes I take photos of my drawings and put them into Photoshop and print them back out on printer paper. It's very messy and all over the place because that allows me to sort of run fast and explore. When I'm on a canvas, I still do feel free, but it's a different kind of freeing. I'm sort of free with my mathematical tools because there I can sort of move around quickly. And so to answer your question, I mean, a collector can see it with very saturated colors and the way that the colors sit. Typically I paint with a fairly broad gamut of colors. So I don't have my color gamut, which are just a set of colors that I always use that are pre-mixed. A lot of artists will do that as well. It's just very convenient. I oftentimes mix a lot of small quantities of color swatches that fill out my gamut for a composition.
So on the subject of archiving work, is there consistency in how the paints archive? And do all the paints archive the same? Do they all age the same?
It's a great question. No, they don't. And it's with modern oil paints and with the medium, with, linseed, walnut oil binders or alkyd. Alkyd resin is another kind of binder that's really common with folks. I happen to use alkyd. I like it. I'm able to control the drying time of my layers pretty well. I dry really fast or kind of thin it, and so it gives them a bit more control. Walnut oil dries really slowly, and linseed oil, I'm less patient, and I like to sort of do a lot of thin layers and washes. The archivality of different pigments is different. Different pigments yellow differently, and all of that is built into my computations, for lack of a better term, right? So if you're into the sort of nerding out over pigments like I am, when you buy paints off the shelf, you get these different archivality codes, right? So oftentimes they'll charge you more for they'll have like Winsor Newton Series 6, which is, you'll have like a lapis lazuli or vermilion, right? That's another really expensive one, right? So there are more expensive pigments that yellow much more slowly, or if at all, and don't fade as fast. And then there are the cheaper ones that oftentimes, a good example of this is quinacridone. Quinacridone is kind of a red pigment. It's usually used in printer ink, for like red ink. Some people use that as their red as opposed to cadmium-based reds because they think cadmium is more toxic. There's some debate around that. But in either case, right, cadmium red fades not as quickly. It's more archival. Now, the way that I go about doing things, I end up from a menu of, maybe 50 different pigments that are offered from Winsor Newton and Gamblin combined, right? So a fairly large selection of different pigments. I end up mixing different swatches using pigments that are coming from one of these two brands from all over, right? And so I am judicious around skewing towards the more archival options that I can select from. But then there are some colors that are just hard to get to unless you use the less archival pigment because they just don't exist, right? An example I can think of are like really bright, desaturated teal colors. You have only a few options to get to certain kinds of colors in like the perceptible colors that exist. And so those pigments do fade. And I think, it's not something that I worry about, the fading of colors. I worry about archivality and that I take care of the surface, right? You want the surface to be sort of protected. So there are protectants that you put on top, but the actual fading of the specific pigments, there are not so many cases where the aesthetic qualities of a composition degrade in such a way that is material, at least for me. It's not as common. And even when I look at certain old masterworks, right? If I go to somewhere like the Frick and I look at the Fragonards there, those are heavily faded. And how they've even faded over the past like 50 years. You can see differences if you look at in books on conservation. But the material aesthetic difference is, for me, not something that I lose too much sleep over.
So within your practice, what do you find more challenging? What do you find more complex? Drawing or choosing your color?
Oh, drawing substantially. Drawing is where I have the most fun, incidentally. I don't sell drawings. Typically, I might start doing some works on paper for a variety of reasons that are more personal than anything else, that not particularly spiritual. But I do a lot more drawing, and I end up making paintings when I'm sort of ready to go. So a lot of the fun for me and what actually happens in studio practice, kind of in air quotes, is really a lot of drawing, because it's a first date, right? It's very non-committal, and I can kind of say something and kind of change my mind and start again and kind of be very wrong, and it's all good. It's a lot of fun. Painting is a bit more serious. You know, you kind of meet the parents, and it's like, okay, well, what are we doing?
I love that analogy.
Yeah, what are we doing here?
Commitment here.
You're committed. Well, once you start the painting, you know, especially now with painting on wood panels, it's with great ceremony that I get these things teed up, and I you know, it's especially with some of the works in this last show where I'm painting with oil paints, but also with wood stain, and getting these comploy effects that incorporate the wood grain. I mean, that's really a serious relationship, right? Because you kind of like have a lot of planning, and you pre-plan a lot of things that are not very glamorous to get from point A to point B. And there's not much spontaneity. It's a lot of just careful planning when you're working with on a wood panel that's unprimed, where you want to see the grain and you want that to sort of figure into the composition and what you're trying to explore. Drawing is a place where, you know, the structure first becomes visible to me. I mean, even when the final painting is lush and kind of materially dense, the underlying logic is built through drawing, the proportion, placement, rhythm, tension. And so I think of it not just as an outline, but as a way to organize my thoughts and kind of where I decide how the objects behave in relation to one another, where the image holds pressure, where the viewer's eye will move, where symbolic charge of the painting will accumulate. And so, yeah, in that sense, drawing it's even like a preparatory step than a more form of thinking. It's sort of the skeleton of the painting. But I don't usually show the drawings. They sort of sit in like this huge, massive pile. And now they're in a couple of boxes with this pile of papers that are often very disorganized until I get to like the very final study for the painting, which has been drawn with Conte, with big pen, with pencil, printed out, photoshopped, reprinted and re-photoshopped, glued on. I mean, it's very slapdash, but it's very enjoyable to me. It's almost collage, but not really, because I redraw things. I will print an actual photo onto a drawing that's already on a piece of paper. And sometimes I print it in the wrong location. But like things like this, and it's just a really fast way to move around and think quickly.
When do you know work is finished?
That's a good one. I mean, it's a feeling. It's oftentimes a feeling. A work is generally finished when further refinement would only make it more polished, not more alive. And it's an aliveness that I'm looking for. It's an aliveness. It's a strangeness. But when I get to a painting, there's a point where the painting has enough clarity and it retains its tension. I don't want everything always resolved. Knowing when a painting is finished is often much easier than knowing when a drawing is finished. You know, I know when a painting is finished when the surface, it seduces me, but it feels a bit unstable. When it comes to drawings, the composition should feel urgent, inevitable. It shouldn't feel closed off, but, you know, kind of reveal itself slowly. But there are other times when I've gone too far, right? When it goes too far.
Is that before or after you meet the parents?
Right. That's still in there. That's before you meet the parents. That's in the drawing where you kind of, you overdo it, and it just, you know, it's funny. So I talk to some collectors in art world folks, and they say to me, you know, your work is really minimalist. Now, I think of my work as generally quite minimalist personally. I'll just throw that out there. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to say, but it's the truth. Some people, I was talking to a guy the other day, and he said to me, David, you know, your works are so maximalist. And I wasn't insulted, but I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't even bother to acknowledge the statement. I just said, oh, well, all right, that noted. But I think that when things can get overdone, it sort of feel like cluttered. I don't like cluttered compositions. I generally want to express an idea and a feeling, and that is happening in the drawing again, with the exception of those paintings where it's a lot of wood stain, and I'm doing a lot of work with the materiality of the wood grain and showing that through. With setting that aside, most of the time, a lot is resolved in a drawing for me. And so there's something there on the paper that, another artist could look at and even paint from, and anyone could just see it and look at it and say, great, these are similar compositions. But beyond that, there's a pretty clear picture in my mind about what's going to go down on the actual canvas or the wood panel. And so the overdoing it and the knowing it's finished kind of happens at the time that I'm drawing it to begin with. I kind of know when to stop. Usually that's very intuitive. Like when I'm handling oil paints, that's much more intuitive. And it's become, I think that it's becoming even more intuitive. I think that drawing is I still have bad days drawing, right? Where it can feel not anxiety inducing in a bad way, but it's still kind of it's still difficult, right? It's still a difficult journey that has ups and downs. Whereas when I'm starting a painting with a drawing that I have a lot of conviction in and where I'm feeling something very strong, it's mellow and generally it's kind of happy throughout. I can start a drawing and not feel very happy at the end and say, wow, I felt really happy half an hour ago. Yikes, I got to take a walk. So that's a bad day right there. It's like, oh gosh, we have nothing in common at all. So the drawings are definitely much more emotional and this not quite answering your question, but I'll share it. Something that happens more nowadays is I will go to the studio on like a Saturday morning and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be in the studio all day until like dinner time and go have dinner with some friends or something. And I'll, do a ton of drawing. I'll go take a walk around the neighborhood and people watch for like 30 minutes and then go back and do some more drawings. And I'm there twirling my mustache, feeling great. I'm like, wow, this is awesome. And like, I'm on a roll. And then at the end of the day, I'll look up what I've done. And then, I have a very different relationship to the work of the day. And that doesn't happen when I'm painting, incidentally. It's just a very different relationship. It's a relationship with a different level of trust. Like I'm never really surprised at the end of a painting as much as I am with drawings. With drawings, I feel something and I can feel something very different come end of day in a way that still surprises me at times. Where I'm like, God damn, that's no good. I'm just, I'm like, all right, well, that's a wrap for today. And that I think is something I'm still working through. And I don't know that I need to work through it. It's just a different relationship.
So, different subject. Do you think Black art can be defined?
Yeah, I think that certainly my attempts to define Black art strictly by style, medium, or explicit subject matter, I've trapped myself when I tried to define that. I mean, certainly during the early 2020s, during COVID, during that period, a lot of Black art was in the public consciousness. Okay, and I certainly thought about it in my own quiet time quite a bit. And the way that I thought about it is that I found that it served to categorize and contain certain ideas within the very institutions that work aimed to critique. I think that to me, Black art, it isn't exactly a monolith in as much as it's a vantage point. So, for example, as a Jamaican man, navigating certain elite, highly curated American spaces, my presence inherently alters the geometry of those rooms oftentimes. And so, in my work, Blackness isn't always represented through direct portraiture. It's sort of embedded as a critique of the systems themselves. And the visual language can sometimes be very disorienting because it's, it's just drawing on old master kind of graphic rhythms that are, some of the old masters themselves might say it's quite retrograde. And so
it's not obvious.
It's not obvious. And so I think, there's some Black artists whose work gets me really excited and fired up when I see it in the context of what we're discussing. There are a lot of Black artists whose work I love, a lot of artists whose work I love. I think in this respect, Rashid Johnson's work gets me really excited because I find it's very nuanced. It's, it certainly takes me in very very unexpected ways and through unexpected paths. And when he puts out new work, I find it really interesting. Chase Hall is another artist whose work I respect, again, in the context of this discussion, and gets me sort of really invigorated. I mentioned Kerry James Marshall earlier. His work, there's a lot of symbolism that if you read a lot of Black American history, the symbolism would not shock you. You wouldn't be like, okay, oh, wow. Yeah, and you're scratching your head and you're like, oh, and it takes you on a journey. So that's not to take away from it. Well, when I say it's more to say that symbolism is rooted in sort of the humanities and in literary ideas that I understood. I feel like I learned a lot about my Black manhood in looking at Rashid Johnson's work and like at Chase Hall. And so going back to my work, I mean, the perspective of the outsider at the feast is sort of an awareness of the tension between sort of access and assimilation, right? And there's a lot that I'm learning about in all sorts of spaces, in elite spaces here in New York, learning about Black American history as well. I grew up in Jamaica, and my childhood experiences were certainly different than had I grown up in the Bronx, like one of my cousins who was also an artist, right? And I guess if Black art can be defined, I would like to define it as sort of an ontological disruption, like a refusal to accept inherited exclusionary symbolic systems as natural, as the way it ought to be per se. But I think it's hard to define.
Thank you. Been talking a while. So, how do you keep learning?
I mean, it's interesting. I have a 9-to-5 where I'm, effectively a mathematician, a researcher, and I certainly read a lot of academic material that is very far from what I do in the studio. It's, mostly academic work on the use of reinforcement learning and machine learning techniques for solving science problems, mostly natural sciences, mathematical sciences. Some of the work by colleagues of mine were very impactful for solving protein folding and other challenges in biosciences. And so I think the crossover between the sort of harshness of mathematics, which was, my second love, my first love being art and storytelling, and the exactitude of pure math, which is one of the things I studied in college, and not even natural sciences, much less art, but natural sciences is interesting. I mean, I think that it's easy to lump science as, just science, but computation and math, I think a lot about. And then I also love a lot of storytelling. I love fiction. I love film. I've recently become a cinemaphile. I'd like to think so. I've started watching a lot of shorts, art house shorts and this sort of thing. And so academic research is something that I actually enjoy, reading a lot of academic research. I learn through looking, reading, building, failing. Looking is probably the most important. I spent a lot of time with historical paintings, so museums. The Frick is one of my favorites. The Met, of course, who could not? One of the obvious ones. The Neue Gallery is another understated one, less popular in New York. And just trying to understand how images were constructed and how they create authority. I also learned through technical experimentation in the studio. So because my process involves computation and is so rooted in materiality, oftentimes that involves using some sort of physical device. In the case of, studying pigments, I use this device called a spectrophotometer, which is able to record down the optical properties of the different pigments that, you buy in the store. And so, the studio becomes a little bit of a laboratory in that, when I'm doing those types of exercises. But I mean, every painting sort of teaches me something about the limits of surface, light, pigment execution, and, just trying to stay uncomfortable.
So what do you feel is the purpose of art?
The purpose of art. I mean, I don't think art needs to have only one purpose, but I do think one of its highest purposes is to make invisible structures we live with and live inside, make visible these structures without fully seeing. I mean, art can slow perception down. It can make familiar things strange again, or the reverse. It can reveal that beauty isn't neutral, that taste isn't always innocent, or desire has its root in history that starts before we even started. And that the self, that certainly I feel that I've been shaped by forces that, I may not fully understand it. And art's taught me a lot of that. I think that it also preserves ambiguity. And I think that in a culture, especially these days, where a culture that sort of wants a lot of moral clarity, art can sort of hold contradiction without resolving it too quickly. And I think that's one of its greatest ethical powers.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed this conversation, have learned a lot. You've tested my thought process in terms of how to understand the work that an artist does, or a unique type of work that an artist does, right? So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me so much. This is really enjoyable, Phyllis.
So there's one more question, and that is, how do you want your work to impact the way people think?
I want my work to make people more suspicious of surfaces, but not less sensitive to beauty. I don't want to destroy beauty, but I want to show that beauty is powerful because it's not always innocent. Ideally, someone leaves the work thinking differently about the objects, the rituals that surround them in their own lives. In the context of this recent show, a bed, a pearl, a polished table, a shell, a gesture of refinement, a room one is allowed to enter into. I want people to ask what those things are carrying, what they promised, what they demand in return, even. And so more broadly, I want my paintings and my drawings even to make people feel the complexity of belonging. The desire to be accepted is real, and the pleasure of beauty is also real. And for the cost of becoming legible to systems that require us to alter ourselves, right? So I want the work to hold all of that at once, and the seduction, the pressure, the vulnerability, and the possibility of seeing through that whole performance. And so it's really thinking about the complexity. And I think that, what did I say? I think it was Steve Jobs who said that the world is a very noisy place. And you mentioned it in the context of branding. It was a talk to Stanford undergrads at the time. But I think about that. We live in a very noisy time. I don't mean that in sort of pejorative way. I mean in almost an analytical standpoint. And so it's navigating that complexity through these vignettes that I think that I enjoy sharing. And so yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing with us different ways of looking at creating and exploring color.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.